suffering a little bit with smoke inhalation. You'll hear about it in a moment. King Nebuchadnezzar. He's not a man to do things by halves. At the end of the previous chapter, he has lifted up Daniel to be a ruler within his kingdom, and at Daniel's request, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been given the rule of the district of Babylon. And because of the ability of Daniel to discern his visions and his dreams, he has told Daniel, your God is the only God, he's wonderful, he's great, he's glorious, he's powerful, there's no one else to worship. The very following verse, he is building gold idols of himself. They are 30 meters high. That's 99 feet in old money, or 70 cubits in really old money. It's a statue of gold set out on the plain, and whenever the music is played by the collective musicians, then the people are to bow down to it and worship the king. I suspect you may be able to identify in your own experiences a few people like Nebuchadnezzar, those who fly from 0 to 100 in a moment, those who seek their own recognition, praise, and glory. The result for people who are not willing to worship, of course, is execution in the most horrible way that we hear about later in the story. And it doesn't even get better at the end. At the end, once he realizes that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have been saved from the fire, we would hope, in the spirit of the Interfaith Week that we're celebrating this week, you'll see the pictures at the back of the church, the installation that we're very pleased to have celebrating this Interfaith Week. You'd hope that the result would be that King Nebuchadnezzar would say, oh, well, now all those who want to profess different faiths within my kingdom may do so freely, rather than everyone having to worship me. But no, instead he says, rather than having to worship me, and if you don't, you get chucked in the fire, now you have to worship the God of Daniel, and if you don't, you'll equally meet a grisly end. So he doesn't ever quite get it right, but he improves a little, perhaps, over the story. Of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are met with this dilemma. Are they to worship the king, to bow down before him when the music plays, or are they to continue worshipping their God? And it's not a difficult decision for them. They carry on worshipping and they disobey the king. Sometimes it can be easier when it's a big issue like that, when we're put to the test on something that we really believe in very deeply, whereas the smaller issues are the ones that we allow to slide past. I mean, equally, if we're faced with the prospect of the fiery furnace, I suspect many of us would find our courage failing as well. When I was at school, I was the model of the teacher's pet in nearly all things. Yes, sir, no, sir, thank you, sir. I remember one time Mr. Martin was handing me pins that were on a board holding up posters, and I thanked him for every single one of these drawing pins he placed in my hand. And as he got halfway through taking down, the 30 posters of our class, he told me that probably this was a little over-eager. But there was one matter on which I got into trouble, and it was at the start. I was probably 12, I guess, so you can date me now. It was at the start of the Iraq War, and I took the day off school, and I wandered around my village with handmade placards. I got my first ever detention for an unauthorized absence, but I in no way felt uncomfortable about it. Sometimes when there are things that we deeply believe in, it's much easier to be disobedient than when there are things that we know we probably ought not to do, but don't matter to us a great deal. Well, just like King Nebuchadnezzar, we in our own time have seen the rise of the strong man, or those governments whom we ought not to be obeying. We've seen Putin, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Trump. In fact, even in this last week, hidden under the bluster of the news about Brexit, you may have just heard the report coming from the UN critical of our own nation. The UN report on British poverty concluded that the UK government had inflicted great misery on its people with punitive, mean-spirited, and callous policies. And in the face of characters like Nebuchadnezzar, it's much easier to do nothing. It's much easier to obey what they tell you to do than it is to stand up over and against them. It's much easier to do nothing than to speak out. But most of history's great terrors have been caused not because of people's disobedience, but because of their blind obedience when they ought to have said no. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are, for us, a great example of disobedience. They are disobedient. They do not obey, but they do submit. They are not willing to bow down and to worship the statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, but neither do they seek by violent means or by secretive means to escape the punishment for doing that. They say, absolutely, you're right, King, we've not bowed down and worshipped you, and we will face whatever the consequences are. And our God, if he chooses to save us, will save us, and even if he doesn't, it doesn't matter, because he is greater than you are. They're not willing to obey, but they are willing to submit. They make their protest peacefully. When you stay true to your beliefs, you still have to face the consequences. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have been saved before they even got to the fiery furnace. An angel could have come and rescued them moments before they were chucked in. But they weren't. They had to go through. They had to persevere. Just the same as we read in the 23rd Psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The writer is still walking the valley. They've not been saved from the trial altogether, but they walk the trial in the presence of God. And so too do Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Yes, they end up in the fiery furnace, but they end up there with the presence of God with them. Earlier this week, we had some people coming round to our house, and we were cooking rice pudding. It was experimental. It's not one of my regular meals. And it was coming on very nicely. It had cinnamon on the top, plenty of cream in it. It looked delicious. But at the same time, in our one oven, we were also trying to cook some chicken and roast some parsnips. And the parsnips were not getting very much colour on them. And I concluded that the best way to improve this was to turn the temperature of the oven up. I didn't quite get it to 7 times its normal temperature, but I kept turning it up to 200, and then after 200 our oven simply has the word max, so I tried that next. And the parsnips went a much better colour, but the rice pudding that I hadn't been carefully looking at, the pudding itself sank, and it developed this thick carbonised layer over the top of what I imagine was the sort of loose cream. Thankfully, you could just kind of peel that off. You took a knife around the edge of it, and it came off as a single chunk and went in the bin. But I'd lost all of the cinnamon flavouring I put on the top. And when we tried the rice pudding at the end of the meal, there was a smoky flavour to it, do you know? It's nice in some other things, isn't it? Barbecued chicken, but it's not nice in rice pudding, it turns out. Well, the rice pudding in our story today is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They've been stuck in the oven, the temperature's been turned up too high. But they come out not even smelling of smoke. They come out unsinged, unhurt. They are pristine, even in the clothes that they go in the first place. This is what happens when God walks through the fire with you. People won't believe it. You don't smell of smoke, there isn't soot on you, your hair isn't even singed. And the very fire that the enemy meant to destroy them with becomes the thing that vindicates them. The fire that Nebuchadnezzar used to intend to destroy them becomes that which miraculously demonstrates the power of their God over and above Nebuchadnezzar. So take heart for whatever fires you're being called to walk through at this time, and take heart to follow in the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, for when your morality calls upon it, to be disobedient. Amen.